I'm Pascal Pachoud. I'm the president of UCAN, and I'll have the pleasure to chair this session this afternoon. Dear colleague, dear friends, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the sixth UCAN Global Seminar, Investing in Lifelong Learning, New Path to Sustainable Funding. This event is organized in collaboration with UPCEA, AAACE and CAUCE. You will have noticed the change of name of the seminar. It used to be the seminar across the Atlantic. This is now the global seminar. We just wanted to make it more global and to be able to involve more people. So today we are addressing a topic that is, I would say, not an easy one. We obviously all talk and think about lifelong learning. We all agree it is essential to respond to major societal challenges such as digital transformation, the green transition, the demographic change. We all agree it is a cornerstone of our societies. Targets are often ambitious, such as the target of the European Pillar of Social Rights, which would like to achieve 60% of adults in training annually by year 2030. But when it comes to funding, it can get really complicated. I think we can put it relatively simply. Nowadays, in many countries, lifelong learning is probably one of the most celebrated ideas in higher education, but it is not always very generously funded or relies heavily on self-funding by learners. Also, we often talk about pedagogy, micro-credentials, digital transformation. I think we less often take a hard look at the following question. How can we fund LLL, lifelong learning for all? Who should actually pay? This question changes everything. For learners, it means access or exclusion. For universities, it means ambition or limitation. For society, it means a reality of lifelong learning or rhetoric. So today is about facing that question. The reality, I think, is quite clear. Costs are rising. Expectations towards universities are increasing, and public funding is often not enough or even decreasing. So today we are going to look at what are the types of financing instruments, what works, what doesn't work, what is the right balance between them, who should contribute and to what extent, and what kind of system do we actually want. Before we start with the presentation, I would like to mention a new UCAN position paper that will be published later today. It is entitled The Robin Hood Model of University Lifelong Learning. This paper argues that while universities are increasingly expected to support lifelong learning, university lifelong learning continue to be funded primarily according to a knowledge and market economy principle. Consequently, social-oriented lifelong learning initiatives often receive limited institutional recognition and financial support. This is why we say that as professionals in university lifelong learning, we often rely on what we call the Robin Hood model, in which revenue from commercially successful programs subsidize initiatives that promote social inclusion and community learning. So I hope this afternoon, with all the presentation and the discussion, we will make a step forward in trying to imagine funding models that will enable universities to strengthen their lifelong learning activities. We're going to now transition to the speakers. To help us explore the theme of the day, we have really outstanding speakers, and I thank them very much. They will bring perspectives from various angles, and they will help us move beyond general ideas to real choices, real opportunities, real examples. Before we start with the speakers, I want to mention that all questions will be taken during the open discussion following the presentation, except for the presentation by the two people from CEDEFOP, Mantas and Patricia, as I think they will be leaving after the presentation. Please write your questions in the chat. The discussion will be moderated by Tamer Atabarut, who is the Secretary General of UCAN, and he will really collect the questions and animate the discussion. So I suggest we now start with a presentation from Lindsay Elamoud, who is Executive Director of AACE at University College Cork. She is a steering committee member of UCAN, and she will talk to us about some of the data collected in the Samuele project on funding challenges for universities in lifelong learning. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Pascal. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to contribute to this discussion and to introduce some of the key insights emerging from the Samuele project data. Samuele is an Erasmus Plus project coordinated by UCAN, bringing together universities and organisations across Europe to strengthen the role of university lifelong learning. Running from 2025 to 28, the project aims to build a robust evidence base on how university lifelong learning is structured, funded, and delivered across different contexts. Its ultimate goal is to support universities and policymakers in embedding lifelong learning as a core sustainable function of higher education systems. The approach that we've taken to data collection in the project has been multi-layered. We conducted a national survey of 18 European countries, collected questionnaire responses from 102 higher education institutions across the continent, as well as 36 inspiring case studies from universities across Europe. What this gives us is something quite powerful. It allows us really for the first time to look across systems, institutions, and practice to understand not just what university lifelong learning is doing, but what is structurally shaping and in many cases limiting its development. And perhaps unsurprisingly for many of us who are practitioners on this call, if there is one theme that cuts consistently across all levels of the data, it is this. Funding is not just a constraint, it is a structural condition shaping what university lifelong learning can become. Across the Samuele analysis, drawing on evidence from 18 countries, over 100 higher education institutions, and 36 case studies, we see a remarkably consistent picture emerging. On the one hand, there is strong and growing policy recognition of lifelong learning. There is increasing institutional activity, innovation, and engagement, and there is clear alignment with major societal challenges, demographic change, digitalization, and labour market transitions. But at the same time, we see something else. Funding systems that are fragmented, short-term, and insufficiently aligned with this level of ambition. This creates what we describe in the report as a structural paradox. University lifelong learning is expected to deliver on workforce development, social inclusion, and regional innovation, but it is not funded as a core public function to do so. If we look more closely at the data, there are three key funding patterns that emerge. Firstly, at a system level, national funding that is available is often highly fragmented. It is typically project-based, short-term, and tied to specific initiatives rather than system-wide development. So what we see is institutions building university lifelong learning on temporary scaffolding rather than stable foundations. And that has consequences because it makes it very difficult to plan long-term, to build sustained partnerships, or to develop coherent lifelong learning ecosystems. Second, at an institutional level, the dominant model is clear. University lifelong learning is largely self-financing. Many universities are relying heavily on fees from learners, employer-funded provision, and competitive funding schemes. Now, this does bring benefits. It creates responsiveness, it encourages innovation, it allows institutions to move quickly, but it also introduces significant risks. Because when funding depends on the ability to pay or on short-term demand, provision begins to follow the market rather than broader societal need. And this is where we begin to see what sociologists would describe as a Matthew effect emerging. Those who already have access to education and resources are most able to benefit from lifelong learning opportunities, while those who could actually benefit most are often least able to access them. So in that sense, funding structures can unintentionally reproduce inequality rather than reducing it. And that leads us to what I think is the core tension at the heart of university lifelong learning. And this has certainly come through from the Samuele data. Is university lifelong learning a public good or a market service? Because in practice, it's being asked to be both. And we see very real consequences of this tension. Coming through the data, we see provision tends to shift towards commercially viable programs, those that can attract higher fees or employer investment. It becomes more difficult to sustain inclusive, community-based or access-focused initiatives. Institutions are required to continuously chase income streams, often at the pace and priorities of employer demands. And as a result, many of our university lifelong learning units are operating in a state of permanent adaptation, responding quickly, but without the conditions needed for deeper structural integration. And I think this is particularly important in the current context because we are living through a period of social division and transformation. There is a real opportunity here for university lifelong learning to contribute not just to skills development, but to social cohesion, civic participation, and building the social fabric. But that requires space to act beyond purely commercial logic. And funding models, as we've seen from the Samuele data, don't always allow for that. One of the most powerful insights from Samuele is how these funding dynamics shape institutional models of university lifelong learning. Through our data, we identified 4 broad models across Europe, ranging from peripheral activity to fully integrated ecosystem approaches. But the key finding is this. Around 76% of institutions are operating in what we describe as a market-responsive model. These institutions are dynamic, agile, and highly responsive to labour market demand, but they remain structurally dependent on fee income and only partially are embedded in institutional governance and systems. And in many cases, this means that university lifelong learning operates almost as a quasi-commercial arm of the universities, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by necessity. And while that model works in many ways, it can also lead to a situation where the social mission of lifelong learning is sidelined. And this raises an important question. If all institutions follow the market in pursuit of their university lifelong learning mission, who is left to serve those who are not in the market? And this leads us to a very important insight. Funding models are keeping university lifelong learning operational when what is needed is structural integration. So why does this matter? It matters because if we continue with current funding structures, university lifelong learning will scale unevenly. Access will remain inequitable and institutions will struggle to move beyond pilot, project and short-term delivery modes. And perhaps most importantly, we risk reinforcing inequalities rather than widening participation. We risk creating systems where university lifelong learning is available but not equally accessible. So what does the evidence from Samuele point us towards? At system level, there are some very clear enablers. Stable, multi-annual funding frameworks that allow institutions to plan and to invest. Integration of university into quality assurance systems so it is recognised as part of the core academic mission of universities. And greater alignment across education, employment and regional development policy. And I think the first of these, in terms of funding frameworks, is absolutely critical because without predictable, sustained funding, it is extremely difficult for institutions to move beyond short-term activity and toward long-term structural integration. At an institutional level, we see a similar pattern. Progress is associated with more diversified funding models, reduced reliance on fee income alone, and crucially the recognition of university lifelong learning as a core institutional mission, not an add-on activity. Because once university lifelong learning is positioned as core to the mission, it begins to influence strategy, governance, and resource allocation in a very different way. So ultimately, the message from Samuele is quite clear. The question is no longer whether universities should engage in lifelong learning. That is already happening, and our data shows us that it is happening at scale. The real question is this: are we willing to fund lifelong learning as a core function of higher education? Because without that shift, university lifelong learning will remain valued in principle, but constrained in practice. If university lifelong learning is funded like a project, it will behave like a project. If it is funded like a system, it can become a system. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that great presentation from the amazing work of Samuele. And I encourage everyone to go and have a look at the Samuele website. Fantastic resources on the website. I suggest now we move to the next presentation. We are very lucky today to have Mantas Sekmokas and Patricia Lipinska from CDFOP that is doing really an amazing work on the question of the financing of adult learning in Europe. Mantas is policy officer and expert in financing and governance of school systems. And Patricia is responsible for research and policy analysis on financing VET and adult learning at CDFOP. Thank you for joining us, and I give you the floor, Mantas and Patricia.
Thank you very much. Let me share quickly the slides. Do you see the full screen? Very
Yes.
good. Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure. And in particular, thank you, Carmen and Pascal, for this. And given the very concentrated time that we have, let me share a little bit of some of the views from our ongoing and actually long-standing work on financing VET and adult learning in Europe. Just two remarks. As Pascal mentioned, unfortunately, we will not be able to stay with Patrizia until the Q&A. But if you would write the questions, we'll try to stay a bit after the presentation to respond in writing. So hopefully that will work. And we will divide the presentation between me and Patrizia. I'll try to give first a more global view and a bit of more statistical picture on adult learning in Europe. And then Patrizia will zoom more into the pooling and sharing, cost sharing of financing of adult learning and different instruments and arrangements that are in Europe based on our research. So to very quickly start, for those who may not know, CDFOP is an independent tripartite research agency, meaning that in our governance, we have both employers, employees, and the governments of the European Union member states. And we're also accountable to the European Parliament and the European Commission. So there are quite a long list of masters to which we need to respond to. And the focus of the work of our agency is on vocational education, training, skills, and qualifications. And to give you a bit of an intuition, there have been quite a few topics lately. We have been looking in depth, including the prevalence of training in enterprises, a dedicated study that Patrizia will talk about, individual learning accounts, a similar also dedicated study on training funds. And more generally, we are making an effort now to make a more comprehensive mapping on the functioning and the structure of adult learning financing systems in Europe. And hopefully the presentation will be shared afterwards with you. And there we include more back-looking studies and work that we have done already since 1990s as an institution, as well as a number of recent events. So starting with the policy context, some of it was very quickly mentioned already by Pascal, but to start with, at the European Union level, adult learning and CVET became a more visible policy priority already in early mid-1990s. And as a result of that policy priority, the EU member states then adopted a target, benchmarks on adult learning. The first one was adopted in 2003. And now the current iteration, as Pascal mentioned, is the target of the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. We also have quite few prominent policy initiatives at the European level targeting adult learning, in particular the 2022 Council recommendation on individual learning accounts, and very, very fresh Council recommendation human capital just adopted 1 month ago, which is more comprehensive, not specifically on adult learning. And we also have been a Draghi report on EU competitiveness, and it had this very specific statement comparing the EU to the US, saying that, well, we want to match, Europe wants to match United States on innovation, we must exceed the US on education and adult learning. And of course, this policy context, policy initiatives and efforts and goals have an impact, or at least an expectation, that adult learning financing systems and governance systems need to adjust and deliver to be able to reach those goals. So when thinking about where the EU versus US stands, as I have just mentioned in the written in the Draghi report, we now have some data that we can compare. Usually the data on participation in adult learning is not globally available, but we do have an OECD survey on adult skills PIAC, which allows us benchmarking to some extent the performance, at least for the participation measures in adult learning between the US and the EU. And you have, as you can see from the slide, we have seen quite a stable but rather modest, if one would say, increase in adult participation rate in Europe, while in the US we have two measures from 2012 and 2023, which should be largely comparable, not fully, but largely comparable. And we indeed see a certain gap if we compare the EU versus US, and also less dynamism in the US. Though again, because of the different waves of the survey, of the PIAC survey, the data may not be fully comparable between the waves, but it gives you a picture. This picture, however, does not reveal the whole picture, if you wish, because it only talks about the participation, how many or what's the share of the population that have had any adult learning activity, formal or non-formal, during a certain reference period, in most cases 1 year. But it doesn't take a picture on the intensity, the number of hours, the frequency. Maybe the participant have more than one activity in a year. And we do see in Europe that this may also give a more enriched picture. Usually for a participant, I think for 2022, we have something around 2.6 average activities per year. And it's also an increase in intensity in adult learning since, for example, 2016. But we have limited time, so I just to give you some snapshots of this. And now when moving to financing, so we have, of course, participation, but financing, of course, is a key driver and enabler already, as was mentioned, for adult learning. And when mapping, this is a picture of mapping adult learning systems and how it's possible to monitor them with existing data. When looking specifically at investment in adult learning, it would seem that there are three major components, and each of them needs to be looked individually, but then together they make a whole. And these components would be the investment by the public sector, specifically by the government, from the employers, and from the individuals. And I would like to, with a few following slides, to show you a little bit the composition, how these different sources of funding combine in the EU based on data that we have, though the data is rather limited. So when calculating absolute figures, there has been a rather raw estimates made for 2015, when a number of European surveys took the same year, so the estimates could be have done for the same year, that allowed to calculate approximately the share of investment, direct, but also opportunity cost of investment in adult learning as a share of GDP. And the main picture, or the main message that I would like, or two main messages that I would like to tell here. First, that the investment is really substantial. So one could compare, for example, with R&D expenditure, which are probably by a quarter larger, but still investment in adult learning overall is really substantive. And the second very straightforward picture that emerges is really that in terms of volume of investment, at least in terms of volume of investment, really employers stand out. So both private sector employers and public sector employers, based on these calculations, would represent something like 2/3 of all adult learning investment in the EU in 2015. Now, going more directly in individual responses. So we have a dedicated survey in adult education survey in the EU, really asking people who have contributed to adult learning. And this also reveals an important role of employers, but it also reveals a more nuanced picture, because it really depends on the type of learning that we're talking about. So if we think about formal education or non-formal training that is not job related, then actually the predominant financier of or funder of that learning activity is often reported to be individual oneself. Of course, one may have hidden subsidies in the cost of provision, but contribution of individual for these forms of learning is rather prevalent. Now, however, if we look at job-related non-formal learning, then a very different picture emerges, where really very few individuals would report to have contributed in terms of direct costs of learning. And really a lion's part of all that expenditure would be employer funded, with also a significant part contribution by some other actors, possibly state or social partners or other actors, where an individual doesn't see the source of funding and reports a particular activity as free. And now decomposing this picture, specifically looking at non-formal activities by country, one would then see that it's not only at the EU on average that individuals would contribute to a limited extent to job-related non-formal learning, but actually it's rather universal across the EU. And this picture takes into account all adult learning activities. It also, in a hidden way, highlights that job-related adult learning is actually the majority of activities that we have, and not job-related activities are much smaller in number. And in any case, if individuals would contribute, they would contribute in all countries more for non-job related activities, and only very few countries would have a more prominent role of individuals paying for job related training themselves. For example, Greece, Lithuania, maybe Portugal, as you would see. So with this, given the very short time, we wanted to give you a bit of a statistical picture on adult learning, and that really the financing and the structures depend on the type of the adult learning undertaken. And with this, I would like to give over the second part of the presentation to my colleague Patricia, who will then look in more detail on the sharing and pooling of resources, and then cost sharing the different types of adult learning in Europe. So Patricia, you can take over with this slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mantas, and hello, everyone. Let me start by underlining what Mantas briefly mentioned, that CEDEFOP has indeed a long tradition of research and policy analysis in the field of financing VET and adult learning, and we have conducted a number of thematic studies by type of financing instrument, with a particular focus on cost-sharing arrangements. So these that aim at increasing private investment, provision, and participation in CVET and adult learning. And as you can see on this slide, we looked at training funds, for example, which generate financial resources based on mandatory levy paid by companies, and distribute the collected funds largely to support employer-provided training, but also skills development more broadly. Then we analyzed tax incentives, which are concessions and tax codes intended by public authorities to encourage individuals and employers to participate in education and training. And next, grants, vouchers, learning accounts, which are public subsidies from general taxation or unemployment insurance, which support companies or individuals' investment in education and training. We also investigated loans, which allow individuals to borrow money on favorable conditions from their future income to cover their education and training expenditure. And we in particular looked at the loans where state plays important role by supporting the availability of loans or co-financing law-related costs. We also looked at regulatory instruments such as training leave, which by statutory right or collective agreement sets out the conditions under which employees may be granted time of work for learning purposes, and the payback clauses, which is another legal instrument which allows employers to bind employees for a certain period of time in compensation for the employer's investment in employees' training. Now, all this information from the thematic studies was consolidated and presented in our database on financing adult learning. You find the link on the slide. And this database has been systematically updated every 5 years. And now I would like to focus on our most recent and ongoing work, and on two types of financing instruments, arrangements, and namely individual learning accounts and training funds. And the next slide, please. So with regards to the first instrument, individual learning accounts, I think it will be useful first to clarify the concept, as it has been used frequently for over the last 2 decades in relation to different forms of public co-funding instruments which target individuals to enhance their motivation and provide incentives to participate in adult learning or training. So ILA has been used interchangeably with the terms such as grants, vouchers, saving accounts, but in our study we refer to the Council recommendation, which introduces a novel and more ambitious concept of ILA. So ILA is understood as a delivery mode for individual training entitlements personal budgets or accounts for all working age adults. And these entitlements are transferable and can be accumulated over time and allow individuals to fund labor market relevant training, career guidance, or validation opportunities. So we launched the study, the purpose of which was to explore the potential for developing ILAs in selected EU member states and provide support, of course, to stakeholders in designing and implementing ILAs. So we conducted 5 in-depth country case studies. And finally, the study formulated country-specific scenarios and policy reflections, as well as general policy guidelines for implementing ILAs. And in our analysis, we focused on countries which already have significant schemes to support individual adult learning. And the aim was to assess what could be the appropriate space for ILA in those countries. So in case of the Netherlands, we observed the development and implementation of recently established STAP scheme. It was discontinued during our project implementation, but still offered important lessons for future. In Estonia, we looked at so-called labor market training with a training card, so demand-side instrument implemented within a mix of country funding policies. And in Austria and Germany, we had the opportunity to study both the national schemes and various regional vouchers, ILA-type instruments. And finally, we chose Ireland for the country with completely different financing adult learning setup. So here, supply-side funding strategies dominate. And there is the income-generating national training fund based on company level, which can provide financing for a variety of policy frameworks, so potentially could fund ILA. In the next slide, so based on our analysis of 5 countries, it seems that different types of adult learning may require different financing arrangements. And in particular, the findings of our research indicate that individual learning accounts may more be suitable for the following 2 types of training: the extended non-intensive non-formal education, which we indicated as type 3 on the slide, the education provided in part-time manner over a period of multiple months, for example, several hours, several times a week, like language courses. So this type of training is likely to imply average to low cost, but the critical issue would be to assure the continuity of such training over multiple years. So ILA, which guarantees the regular multi-annual financial support, would be very useful. And the other type of training, which seems of particular relevance for individual learning accounts, it's short duration courses to develop work-relevant skills, which we indicated as type 4, delivered in a rather concentrated manner over the period of several days or weeks. And now let me move quickly to the second study. The next slide, please. It is the study that analyzed training funds in the EU with in-depth analysis carried out in 8 selected member states. And these are Belgium, Cyprus, Denmark, Spain, France, Ireland, Italy, and the Netherlands. And in addition, we explored the potential for establishing new training funds in the countries that do not have such tradition of implementing this instrument. And we developed guidelines for policymakers and social partners on establishing new training fund in a country or improving the functioning of the existing training funds. Next slide, please. We researched training funds taking into account their important role in CVAT and adult learning, as they can mobilize substantial financial resources through mandatory levy on employers, which then these financial resources are distributed to support mainly employer-sponsored training, but also skills development more broadly. So this generating resources function is critical in the context of the challenge that many member states in the EU face currently in terms of ensuring sustainability of funding for training and adult learning. But what I would like to underline, that training funds should not be seen just as financing instruments, as they are highly diverse institutions, which often develop into complex organization and play a key role in governance, relevance, and the quality of training and adult learning. So they often have a long history, but to remember, they're highly heterogeneous institutions across the countries. So usually, however, they are set up at national level with tripartite governance and the levy defined by law, or sectoral level with bipartite governance and the levy defined in each sector based on collective agreements. The main income, as I mentioned, comes from company levy. So it is a certain percentage of payroll, like additional kind of taxation. But some further funding may come from government subsidies, financed from general taxation, which tops up the company levy, the bank interest, or EU funding, and which form of support the training funds offer. Of course, financial support to companies, but also training providers, and sometimes also directly to individuals. They can directly provide training by using their own facilities, or provide non-financial and system services in terms of, for example, advisory services to companies on HRD, research on labor market and skill needs. They may collaborate with education and training providers to co-develop training aligned with labor market needs. And they also play an important role at system level by acting as knowledge hubs for providing labor market analysis, qualification tools, or quality assurance. In the next slide, so according to our research, the training funds are established in 30 member states. In the color dark blue, you have those that they play systemic role in the provision of CVET and adult learning. And in this grouping, we have the countries with a single national training fund or multiple sectoral training funds. But in some other countries, you will find training funds established only for some sectors, like in Austria, Germany, Luxembourg, or on voluntary basis in Slovenia. And to conclude, the next slide, please, we can say that training funds play an important role in CVET systems and other learning systems, and they support the skills development. First, as I mentioned, because they can secure indeed substantial and sustainable funding through employer contributions, which are topped up often by public funding. Now, second, they ensure better alignment between training provision and employer needs, and they improve the quality of training. Thirdly, by reducing training costs, promoting skills development, and supporting sectoral mobility, they can encourage more employers and employees to engage in CVET. They can also address inequalities in access of CVET, as certain training funds introduce specific measures targeted towards specific groups which are underrepresented in training and adult learning. And they are important knowledge hubs for employers, for training providers, individuals on the CVET adult learning system. They perform strategic steering functions, and overall, we can say they stimulate development of a learning culture. And importantly, also, they ensure continuity, sustainability, and financial support to CVET and adult learning against business cycles and fluctuating policy attention given to training and adult learning, because the training funds have independent structures, government management bodies, and it helps to mitigate the government changes and priorities. So to say shortly, it is indeed a very powerful policy tool. So with this, I will finish my presentation. For more info, please refer to the annex in our presentation where we provide the links to the outputs of our work. But of course, should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us and we will respond in writing to your inquiries. And once again, apologies, like Manta mentioned, that we cannot stay in the meeting longer with you, but we will be happy to answer any of your questions should you contact us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mantas and Patricia. And thanks for this really great overview of the different instruments and how they can work. So as suggested by Mantas, if you have questions, maybe you write them in the chat. And Mantas suggested you could stay a bit more to write the answers directly in the chat or later, and feel free to contact them. We're gonna now move to the presentation by members of the panel. We're gonna start with Corina Caraccioli, who is assistant professor at the Louisiana State University and affiliated with AAACE. She's going to give us a view from the US, together with the next presentation from Hamie Heitzman. So we start with the US, your views on funding of continuing education.
Thank you. Hi, everyone from Southern USA. As I was mentioning, this is almost 8 a.m. here. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this important discussion. I do have the pleasure of representing the American Association for Adult and Continuing Education, AAACE. Although I do have European roots, AAACE is dedicated to providing leadership for the field of adult and continuing education by expanding opportunities for adult growth and development. And of course, important to our mission is ensuring that lifelong learning opportunities are accessible. And so funding represents a major challenge for adult learners. And as we've heard from the previous presenters, and I did appreciate you sharing rigorous research. This is just going to be a brief overview, though. As we've heard, lifelong learning is essential, not only for economic growth, but for social cohesion, individual well-being, and democratic participation. And in the United States, we invest significantly in lifelong learning, but we do so through a system that raises the central question of this panel. How do we make lifelong learning access sustainable and inclusive? And in practice, this is a cost sharing, as what mentioned, it's a shared investment model with responsibility being shared across the government, employers, and individuals. And I will just give a brief overview of some of these investments. We only have a few minutes available, so this is definitely going to be a general overview. The first one is public funding. So public funding plays a central role, particularly through the U.S. federal financial aid system, which includes grants, loans, and work study. And at the center of this is the federal Pell Grant. Pell Grants are need-based grants that do not need to be repaid by students. They are awarded primarily to students that are enrolled in accredited credit-bearing programs, and eligibility is based on financial needs determined through a national application process. Importantly, students do need to continually prove satisfactory academic progress in order to maintain eligibility. And this is why it's important for higher education institutions to be regarded and to function as an ecosystem, because institutions typically have financial aid offices. However, most of the institutions do provide student services to ensure that adult learners, many of them coming back to school from a large break, are successful and are able to continuously enroll and maintain that satisfactory academic progress. Also, much of the federal financial aid also includes loans, meaning that adult learners often share significantly in the cost of their formal education. And at the graduate level, financial aid works a little differently. Students still are able to access federal financial aid, but not Pell Grants. And so as a result, many master's students rely on loans or employer support, out-of-pocket funding, and assistantships. At the same time, doctoral education can be covered through graduate assistantships or doctoral assistantships or fellowships or research grants that are supported by federal agencies. Then states also play a significant role in funding lifelong learning. They may provide their own financial aid programs. They provide funding for public colleges and universities, which lowers tuition for residents. This is why state institutions in particular, they have funding for in-state and out-of-state learners. And they do administer workforce and adult education programs at the local level. This also has flexibility, but contributes to variation and complexity across the system. For workforce-oriented lifelong learning, the primary federal framework is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that supports short-term training, career navigation, even support services such as childcare and transportation. And it plays an important role in expanding access. However, it is targeted towards individuals with low income and those who are unemployed or underemployed. Additional support under this comes from the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which funds literacy and foundational skills through adult basic education programs. These programs are free in many locations, and they aim to help individuals to succeed at work in their communities, and they serve as a bridge to high school equivalency programs, career training, or higher education. And then the other one is employers who are an increasingly important source of funding. And many employers do offer education benefits and tuition assistance, and this includes higher education institutions that offer varying tuition remission for their employees, as well as for their dependents, but they are highly heterogeneous, as Patricia also mentioned. It varies. Also, partnerships with learning providers, including higher education institutions, And this reflects a shift towards shared investment, particularly for workforce aligned learning. However, again, access depends on employment and benefits vary widely across sectors. And then we do have the individuals who continue to carry a significant share of the cost through out-of-pocket payments or student loans within the federal financial aid system. And then there are also community and philanthropic models as well. Again, these opportunities are often localized and limited in scale. And so across all of these areas, the key challenge is not simply funding, but alignment. As I've given a brief overview, the U.S. invests through federal financial aid, state assessments, and workforce programs, but these are not well integrated. And so I will leave this important part of the workforce Pell, which is the newest policy, to Amy, my counterpart here representing the US, to talk a little bit about the workforce Pell. Happy to take questions afterwards or continue the conversation offline.
Thank you very much, Corina. Before we move to Amy, I'd like to tell to Mantas, there are, I can still hear a couple of great questions in the chat.
I am responding. Yes, I am responding.
Tricky ones, in the sense that asking you what are the most impactful in terms of inclusion and responsiveness, or Joe is also asking. I can see you're answering. Okay, so I'll let people read the answer. So now we move to Amy Heitzman. Amy is Deputy CEO and Chief Learning Officer of UPCEA, the Online and Professional Education Association in the United States.
Hello, my friends. Thank you so much. And I so appreciate the opportunity to be here. Carmen, thank you for your team for a chance to visit, but also for my slides. Folks, as Lindsay and as Corina noted, funding in the US exists, but it is fragmented. And I loved the way that Lindsay talked about it being on an inconsistent scaffolding. Absolutely, we will see that, and I'll raise you. My friends, UPCEA leads and supports 17,000 members through research, networking, mentorships, conferences, and advocacy at the policy level. Corina is one of the members of our esteemed policy committee, so thank you so much for that conversation. Our focus is, as Pascal mentioned, is in online professional continuing education, and we help our members who are helping others to continuously reinvent their lives through higher education. But for today's conversation, I'm incredibly excited to be here today to talk with you through one of the levers that Corina mentioned, federal workforce Pell grants. This is a new change. This is coming into effect July 1st, and institutions across the nation are gearing up to meet the needs of this important opportunity. In the US, workforce Pell represents one of the most significant policy shifts we've seen in decades for lifelong learning. Corina mentioned that Pell grants have long existed as needs-based opportunities for talented humans to enter the four-year pipeline. Workforce Pell is now designed for workforce-facing short-term credentials, which is new in terms of our territory. But we are quickly learning that this is not just a funding opportunity, it's a test of whether our institutions are truly ready to demonstrate on outcomes and quality data collection. Those are the things that will be essential for Workforce Pell. So what is Workforce Pell? I mentioned that Pell grants in typical are needs-based federal subsidy for undergraduate degrees. Workforce Pell is for short-term aligned with our workforce demands, and it launches this summer. It matters because the policy expands access for adult and working learners who may not pursue full degrees, but to their credit need high-quality job-relevant skills. Micro-credentials are among those that will be funded through these policies. And this elevates the short-term credential role in our landscape, but it also signals a broader shift toward outcomes-based funding in terms of US higher education. But there's a catch, my friends. This opportunity comes with very strict accountability requirements, and programs must meet 3 thresholds. They must demonstrate at least 70% completion rates. They must have 70% job placement within 180 days, and earnings outcomes that exceed the costs of the program. These are new. These are important. They should be in place, but they are challenges for institutions because we don't typically gauge these things. This is a significant shift, particularly on access enrollment and providing measurable outcomes. So the real challenge is the data readiness, and that's this slide that I've got here for each of you. On the left, we have siloed systems, unclear definitions, difficulty proving outcomes. This is where most of us in the US, in terms of higher education institutions, this is where we're at. On the right, coordinated systems, standardized data, verifiable, trackable outcomes. That's the goal. But most institutions are still operating on the left, but Workforce Pell requires the right. So where are we today? If I might have the next slide. In a conversation that we had at our annual conference just week before last, and Karina helped facilitate this as well, we asked our institutions generally, where are you at in terms of being able to track completion rate, placement rate, and outcomes in terms of earnings? Most of our institutions are only beginning to think about where they're at. They're just starting. Very few are ready for the full accountability, full court press that Workforce Pell is going to require, and it is moving faster than our systems can allow. As most of you recognize, it is not systemic just to the US, but our higher education institutions are not often nimble. I know, such a surprise. So there are some key challenges that I'll dive into in just a second. Who owns this work? Where on campuses are these data being collected? Is the ROI worth it? Is the churn to collect placement, outcome, earnings data, is it worth the funding? We're seeing that some institutions are simply saying no thank you, which in and of itself is a challenge. But also, where do we begin? Often professional continuing and online education units, those that are housing these programs, are not often tied to, say, the registrar or the bursar's office because they're entirely non-credit. And so financial aid processes that might live on the credit side are not part of workforce demand education at institutions. So we have a bit of a divide that we need to cross. So how is UPCEA helping? If I can see with the next slide, my friends. We have a very robust checklist. This is not the checklist. I will share with you a link to resources in the chat in just a moment in terms of the checklist. But there are 5 particular areas that UPCEA is helping institutions to begin to pivot toward in order to be ready for Workforce Pell eligible programs and therefore access to these. And we're helping institutions move from awareness to this is an opportunity to an action. And these areas include program design, data systems, governance, student support, and last but not least, compliance and policy. It encourages institutions to start small. Do not attempt to boil the ocean. Not all programs will be Workforce Pell eligible, and this is a big consideration. But begin small. Do not create programs just for this opportunity, but begin to see how you might pilot with one or two programs. And while Workforce Pell is US specific, the lesson is broader, and that's the part that's important for today's conversation. Funding can drive innovation, but only if the data and the systems are aligned. And you'll see that as the through line for most of my colleagues in our conversations today. So Workforce Pell, in closing, will raise, if I can see the last slide, please. Workforce Pell will raise the bar in terms of what counts as credential, what counts as being funded, what counts as being worth data. Actually, the next slide with the QR code would be great. It's not just a funding opportunity, it's an opportunity to redesign for university lifelong learning. And with that, I will leave you with this code, which points to a page on UPCEA's website that lists a series of policy briefs and Workforce Pell readiness checklists. And while that will necessarily translate mostly to US institutions, it is the frameworks that I encourage you to take a look at and to explore how can we begin to consider ways that transatlantic, that we can expand access and expend systematic federal funding for all of these opportunities. And so with that, I will turn it to my dear friend, Joanne Clark. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Hello, good morning from Victoria. I'm in Victoria, BC in Canada, which is on the very far west tip, and it's the lands of the Cohsapsum and Wasanich and Esquimalt people who have governed our lands for millennia, and I'm really privileged to work and live on these lands. I just want to start by saying thank you to everybody for the work that you're doing to elevate lifelong learning across not only your areas, but across the world. Of course, this is an area we're all passionate about. I would say, building on what Amy said in Canada, so I'm the president of the Canadian Association of University Continuing Education, as well as the dean of the University of Victoria Continuing Education. So we are a network of over 40 universities across Canada who meet and work together to raise our voices about the importance of lifelong learning universities in Canada. Really, in listening to your presentations, I mean, so much of it, Lindsay, you just framed everything so beautifully. Everything you said, I was like, yep. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing on that research. I think it's really important that we are advocating and sharing that research widely and doing some of that and making sure that we are providing. Nobody else is really speaking for us, so we're going to have to speak for ourselves and do this kind of research in the sector. And I would say that's going to lead me to where we are in Canada, which is very much like many of you. Governments are interested. They don't have data. We're not included in the data collection for universities and reporting on learning outcomes. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of data collection. In our association, we have been working on data collection for a number of years with our own surveys, just so that we can show the impact and the volume that we're having, the impact in our local communities, as well as across our nation. And I think it's moving the needle in terms of people are starting to pay attention. They're paying attention because of the urgency, as we all know, of lifelong learning and skills, the skill shortages and what's happening I think across the world in many ways. So really, I'm not going to be too long. I want to focus on sort of three areas that I think are happening here to give you a sense. One is government funding. So at a national level, our federal government has recognized their skill shortages. They are aligning funding in the mechanisms that are existing. So they're trying to leverage things like employment insurance, federal funding for grants, tax incentives, some of the things that were listed earlier, in order for people to access funding for training. And this is the first time, honestly, in my career, long career, that I have seen more emphasis on mid-career adult learning, and that non-credit learning is being recognized by governments, which is fantastic. We're like here, we're not very far, but it's starting to happen. It's in the conversation. It's included in the funding calls. So that's a very positive thing. In Canada, there's national mechanisms that they can, levers that they can pull on some of that, but most of it happens provincially, and we're a very big country. And so our local needs are quite different across the country. So the provinces will also look at how do they align that funding to their provincial priorities. I think one of our earlier speakers talked about good news, bad news, but a lot of that's going to the needs of the province, which in our areas are health, science, technology, lots of the STEM areas. For people who aren't part of those STEM areas, we see a big gap. And I think that's something that universities and others need to pay attention to, that not all of this is directly related to the government priority, because there's lots of jobs that are also not being funded, and skills training that's not included in that. So I wanted to share with you something a little bit innovative in my province here in British Columbia, is the government has chosen to put together what they call a future skills grant. And this is only in our province, but they have put together $3,500 for every single adult in our province, every single resident. Doesn't matter who they are. There's no requirements to do a lot of proving about this or actually, but you can access $3,500 to take micro-credentials or short skills training programs. Now, when they started, the list of programs that were approved was massive. It's now down to more focused on government priorities, but we do see some room in there for other types of programs. And in our case, about 70% of learners who access that fund were new to us, which means they're not those people who are paying for their education. They are people, and to me it says people want education, and they need it, they can't afford it. So they had some access, and it was based on the individual, which was kind of different. Because sometimes in my experience, all of the funding mechanisms from the government, they are great, but there's a lot of funding for employers, for example. We have a new initiative from our federal government where employers can apply for up to $15,000 per individual for training, which is great. It's a massive amount of money. It'll be around trades, construction, some of their priorities. The challenge is most of our industry is small to medium-sized enterprises. The bureaucracy around how to apply for funding, even knowing about the funding, how to then align it, is a lot of work when they're running their own businesses. And we know that in Canada, at least, small to medium-sized business owners are struggling. They're already short-staffed. They already have a lot of work to do. So sometimes it's about creating those mechanisms, but actually aligning them or helping people to access them and support so that they can actually get that funding, I think is really important. The second thing I want to talk about is micro-credential frameworks. I feel like we're way behind some of you folks around, it's varied. It's across our country. No one knows what a micro-credential is. So we have a lot of work to do. But what we're seeing bubble up is enough of those conversations that it's now part of people's consciousness, and there is an understanding that it's coming along. And in my area, we have a very good transfer system, a credit transfer system where students can take credits from one institution, apply them to another. What we're doing is leveraging that to look at adding micro-credentials into that transfer system. So people can then have their skills assessed and apply to another program and have those count towards other things. So we're trying to work at leveraging, again, those existing cooperative systems so that people can start to make their micro-credentials become portable between institutions, and they can start building their own learning pathways. And then the last thing I want to talk about is what we're doing in academic institutions. And we do see people moving, CE units, continuing education, lifelong learning units, moving more to the center. Nearly every institution has a continuing education but it is what you've said earlier. It's like, can you make us revenue? Are you revenue generating? Versus the mission of what continuing education has always been, which is about opening access, bringing education to people, allowing people to access education. So we have a problem here that we're always negotiating with our institutions to get an alignment of understanding to say, yes, we will. I love this Robin Hood mission. That's a fantastic, we will have higher value, higher price point programs that people can afford, but we need to use that to subsidize the areas where people can't. We also have to be careful, I think, about only putting dollars into training programs around STEM. We have people in other areas. We have a social mission to look at things like equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and how to build that into all of our programs so that people are learning all kinds of a liberal arts education. There's a commitment, I think, in some universities to make sure that is embedded into programs or becomes an important part of programs so that we don't only get certain kinds of training that's accessed by select groups, that there's a wide variety. This is always our academic mission. We have a wide variety of learners, and we have to be able to provide programming that is responsive to all. Last thing I want to say is that continuing education units, at least my colleagues across Canada, are super efficient with administration. So, versus universities who, it costs a lot more. They're just bigger and bureaucratic. So one of our challenges is how do we provide that service to the university without becoming only a service where they expect sort of us to just serve their academic colleagues, but that we have some value in our pedagogy. We have value and we know how to design learning for adult learners, which can be different for mid-career adults. And then also we're just really efficient. So when we do make revenue and profits, can we use those responsibly? One of the things we're setting up is we're expanding a bursary model here in our unit to set up some funds that we know aren't going to be funded through other areas and to make that accessible to people so that they can access some of the training. It's not systemic, as you were talking about earlier. It's very much how people approach their work. It's very much individualized, and that can be good. It can be bad. When we become a big system, sometimes we do lose that responsiveness. That's the challenge. We become very heavy on bureaucracy here. So, so just to sort of close off, who should pay? And in my mind, it's a multi-pronged approach. We have to leverage all of those mechanisms, from government as a system, and the last thing I would say is employers, quite honestly, I don't feel like they're paying enough. They're the ones who are gaining from skilled workers. And here we do, and again, I understand the small to medium-sized enterprises are challenged sometimes, but we need employers here to step up and to be part of that conversation, not just what they need, but what they're willing to contribute and because it really is going to take all of us working together. No longer can we work in silos. We are convening those kinds of tables to have that discussions. And then we all have to pony up, and we have to make this happen and do our part in that system. So I just wanted to say thank you again for the opportunity to join you. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And I'm really looking forward to reading some of the research and accessing that and using it to prod my colleagues here in Canada. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Joanna. And also, thank you for framing the question, what is paid for? Not only who is paying, but what type of courses. We're gonna now move in space and time to give the floor to Renee Tan, who is director of the research division at the Institute for Adult Learning in Singapore, where I think it is 9 o'clock in the evening. So I give you the floor, Renee.
Thank you, Pascal. And thank you, everyone, for the honor of me being here as the lone Asian. I think I am. I am indeed really very privileged to be here. Right. I thought I would take the very little time that I had just to give a quick overview because of the Skills Future movement here in Singapore, because so that to allow us that more time to engage in discussion later. I think the Skills Future movement was set up, to allow for all Singapore citizens to be able to achieve their fullest potential. So that was the policy construct, and it was shaped as a framework in order to allow for the funding of learning through what I think you would call an individual learning account. Over here, we call it the Skills Future Credit. So every single citizen in Singapore, age 25 and above, gets a certain sum of money that gives them agency and access, agency of choice and access to choose the kind of learning that they want to take on. And this, of course, is over and above employer-provided training and learning, because employer-provided training and learning is for economic purposes, for the organization, for skill building of a specific type. But the Skills Future Credit is to move the nation towards the understanding that learning is, yes, largely for work, but also for lifelong learning purposes, for growth, for reskilling, for upskilling, but for personal growth and development. And we have, in fact, conducted some studies over at the Institute for Adult Learning to say, well, how has the Skills Future Credit worked so far? So it has worked because we asked in a large-scale national type survey, if you did not have the Skills Future Credit, would you have taken up the learning that you took up? And a significant percentage actually said no, which meant that it was Skills Future Credit that gave them the impetus to say, okay, I will now commit the time and the money towards my personal growth. So that, I think, is the policy intent of not just access, but motivation and drive. Okay, and because there is agency in the learner with this, it actually leads to that enhanced personal satisfaction in the learning that they undertake. So it's not because somebody told you to go and learn something, but now the control is in your hands, right? And you can choose how you want to invest that funded portion that's given by the government. The second thing to note about Skills Future Credit is that in Singapore, we practice the notion of co-payment very strongly. So you can never use the Skills Future Credit to fund, well, not so much that you can never, but there are portions that you are able to, a percentage of the training cost that you are able to fund with the Skills Future Credit. But at the end of it, you may have to put a small sum in yourself. And this sum, no matter how small, is to drive that skin in the game, right? To say that when you do commit to learning, you are committing to learning. You are committing to something that will not be spent, just for the sake of it. And that again is to ensure that policy intent of making sure that whilst the supply is there, the demand goes on to meet the supply. So in other words, the learners are the ones who will demand that learning. Okay, so with that, the Skills Future credit usually overshadows everything else in terms of the funding. On top of Skills Future credit, the government does subsidize learning, especially in crucial areas. So like right now, and they can fund in different ways. So they can fund learning programs. They can also fund like specific tools of specific moves to ensure that the nation as a whole has access to means of upgrading. So take, for instance, artificial intelligence. So AI is like the norm everywhere. And the call is, that every organization has to engage with AI in both work and learning, etc. And so how do we get the workforce beyond AI awareness into AI literacy and importantly, AI fluency? So yes, there's the whole structure of funding the AI programs, making sure the individuals, know where to go with the AI programs. But the government also said, well, okay, AI tools, we will fund access to the AI tools for a period of time so that citizens have access to go in and explore and learn non-formally for themselves how AI works and what it means to them, the implications. So learning then becomes like a holistic endeavor. It's not just sitting in a classroom. It's not even, being in workplaces where somebody is trying to deliver some kind of skill growth in your area, but it is the engagement with what is meant to push you along in growing your understanding, your awareness, your literacy, your fluency with the latest that is coming up. And then there is the employers, right? So the employers, there is a levy-based fund that employers contribute to. But there is also employer-provided funding. So this ensures that the employers build the skills of their own workforces to their particular intent. And this message has leverage in Singapore because many studies done in Singapore are showing that Singapore is very much heavily dependent on small and medium enterprises. And we find that the best small and medium enterprises are those who know how to use their business strategies alongside their people development strategies to create new value. So when small and medium enterprises are aware that the best small and medium enterprises are doing it this way, then the onus is on them to make that link and to grow their workforces to the extent that their workforces contribute in different ways to creating that value alongside them. So it doesn't become an us against them game, and it doesn't become, the employers are just investing in learning because they need the workers to fulfill certain things. Now the workers take part in actually saying, well, where can we go? How can we grow? So learning then becomes coupled with innovation and growth as well. So all this then makes it very persuasive for people to use, to get into the learning mode, so to speak. National narratives also drive that, the fact that it is good as society to learn and to keep learning and growing in all ways possible. And it also brings us to reflect that whilst the funding, brings access to all these learning opportunities, systemically, we also have to set up the structures and the means for the learners to navigate the learning landscape. So, if you want to give them the agency and the control, then they need to also find ways to navigate and maneuver the landscape. So wayfinding and access to information about programs, suitability of programs, transitions and frameworks to gauge what skills they are meant to grow. All these are also available as part of this move in Skills Future. So I think I'd like to leave us all with the concept that funding does indeed do a lot. We've seen it in Singapore, albeit the fact that Singapore is a very small country. And therefore, we have better means, I think, of centrally, holding on to such a system. However, we've also found that beyond the funding, we need to lay the steps for learners, workers, citizens to understand how they benefit and they may benefit further from engagement in learning. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renee, for telling us about the situation in Singapore and Skills Future, which is even used as an example in terms of what to do in lifelong learning. So that was great to hear it from you. I'd like to remind you that you can post your questions for the panel in the chat. I think Tamer is going to get desperate if there is no question in it. So please ask your question. I also want to draw your attention on something that Carme just mentioned in the chat. It's a new initiative from UCAN. These are the podcasts that we that we register with an actor in the field of lifelong learning in Europe. So we have a podcast channel, and Carwe was mentioning a podcast with Renee. So please go and have a look at what we offer. So we're gonna now move to our last speaker, Mary Mahoney, longtime friend of UCAN, freelance consultant, previously director of lifelong learning at the University of Wolverhampton, and I would say really one of the pillars of you all in the UK, the UK Lifelong Learning Network. And Mary is gonna tell us about the LLE, the new lifelong learning entitlement in the UK. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Pascal. I've produced a presentation because I'm the last speaker and I need to wake you all up. But I just need to say to Renee, I've just come back from Hong Kong. So whilst I don't know about the Singaporean program, it was presented at a conference I was at last week in Hong Kong, and it just blew my mind. So I wish I was presenting on the Singaporean scheme rather than the LLE, which looks like something similar but not quite as good. So the lifelong learning entitlement signals a brand new funding system for higher education in the UK. If we could have the second slide, please, Kame. The LLE is a really innovative and transformative new funding system for post-18 learners, so that's adult learners and anybody in the tertiary system, so both higher education and further education. And it's going to change the landscape radically. It starts next year. There's still a lot of uncertainty about it, but what it does is positioning lifelong learning centrally within universities. And many universities, particularly the large Russell Group universities, are launching strategically positioned lifelong learning departments that are driving the initiatives centrally. We have also undertaken as an association work to encourage universities to understand the need for placing lifelong learning at the heart of their strategic plan, and have been very successful in doing this. So what does it involve? It's enabling individuals to study either degree programs or to buy short packages of learning or to buy specific modules. It's still based on an individual loan system, So an individual can have a loan entitlement of a fixed amount until they're age 60, and they can study variously across those options of what I'm calling short courses, chunks of learning, or full degree programs or parts of full degree programs. So it provides them flexibility on where they study. This has been rolled back a little bit because quality assurance and degree classifications started to pose some really difficult questions for universities about how they would manage this. And we were able to, as the Professional Association in UK, to encourage the government to understand that some learners will need maintenance support, so that will be free aspect of the loan. The loan will be paid back for their course of study if they are in full-time work and earning a particular salary. But if they need a maintenance loan, they don't need to pay that back. So the Student Loans Company has undertaken a radical review of its systems and processes and is only just completing that process in readiness for rollout next year. So funding is available, as I've said, to adults of all ages up to the age of 60. I think they think beyond that age, they won't be able to pay back through payments from their employment. So if you would pass on to the next slide, please. The reason why this was introduced is pretty clear. The UK sadly exited the European Union several years ago, and the impacts of Brexit on the UK economy means that we have had a radical loss of highly skilled workforce and the breadth of expertise we need to run the country. We have lost the benefits of connecting to Europe, particularly through partnerships, innovation, research funding, etc. And we're ever so grateful to still be a part of UCAN, who have never lost we've never lost our contact with them. We're so grateful for that. Obviously, the impacts of COVID were felt by everyone, but the combination of Brexit and COVID happening at a similar time meant that we also lost a lot of employees to movement, working differently, and for retirement. But also this radical technological change that we've talked about as well today means that the focus has to be on train, retrain, upskilling of the workforce. The other crucial thing that's happened in the UK is that universities haven't been able to charge additional fees to learners for a very long time. So debt levels of universities because of COVID, but also because they haven't been able to charge additional fees, means that many universities are really struggling financially. And that's why I left the University of Wolverhampton. It was the first university to end up with a £20 million deficit at the point of COVID. And so they had to shed a lot of staff, and I willingly left due to workload. So we have a real issue, but also the previous government didn't help, because they talked about low value degrees, etc. And why would people invest in higher education if they could just go and get a job anyway? So there was a kind of devaluing of the degree program. So the lifelong learning entitlement is meant to radically shape the approach. It's being rolled out in England in the first instance, but I think the plan will be to roll it out into Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland once the trial process has been undertaken. Next slide, please. So there's a clear problem that we are needing to attract learners back into higher education. There's an understanding that a standard degree program will take too long to address that program, for 3 to 4 years of, adults can do this much quicker. We can offer them options for either undertaking a full program or part of a program. So I think if we're paying attention here at this point in the presentation, this is a very much the Matthew principle, because individuals who know how to work a higher education system will understand their options, they'll understand how to build a program, and they'll understand how to use the bite-sized module-based selection. But those who have no understanding of it will really struggle. to understand, one, why they need higher education, two, to understand their eligibility. So it'll be probably a stepwise process into further education and then moving across into higher education. So technical and vocational routes are changing radically as well through this. They'll also need to understand how to navigate university systems and environments, and this will be potentially an issue for adults, lifelong learners and continuing education students from non-traditional backgrounds, such as those we worked with at the university that I worked at. So this will be a hard learning journey, whilst at the same time universities are not paid for anything additional for support for non-traditional learners at this stage. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Carme. So how this will operate for universities and colleges of further education, some of whom offer the early years of higher education provision, they have to radically shape their whole structures and their provision to provide both full programs, and for many universities, students will just enrol in a full degree or diploma or certificate course. For others, they will really push the options for short programs developed in partnership with universities. So we're seeing great innovation being showcased at seminars and conferences on the introduction of the lifelong learning entitlement. And I saw one recently where one of our lifelong learning department colleagues has been central to a partnership working on a skill shortage in a particular part of the country, working with an Institute of Technology, so a further education institution, and all of the universities in that area to focus on the electrification program, offering courses from short courses to full programs for employees who either want to work in electrification or are currently employed in electrification at leader level, manager level, and then down to technician level, etc. So they're taking a whole of region response to it. So universities are needing to innovate to understand this. They obviously have to move from quality assuring the full programs, which are really clearly structured, to then also offering accreditation for shorter programs as well. If you could go back, Carme, I'd be grateful, because I haven't quite finished that slide, and that's the main slide from a university perspective. So they have to accredit short programs as well as full degree programs. So new systems are being developed by the Quality Assurance Agency. They have to market their programs to different types of learners for different reasons. They have to know how to work with employers and regional governments, etc. And to respond to skills needs, they have to have really realistic outcomes, learner outcomes for all learners. They have to survive in an uncertain funding environment, and they have to provide different types of learners with new types of learning support whilst they're fairly broke. So there's a binary now in the UK between universities who have this ability to do this and to transform and the resources to do so, and the smaller universities that are going to struggle to do this. So that we'll see mergers, I think, happening. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're seeing problems embedded in the context. The challenges and the concerns are a bit like this, but hopefully it won't look like the next slide. Thanks, Carme, where we end up flattening ourselves by our ambition. And that's why I was so impressed with the Singaporean model. There's so many unknowns and unknown unknowns in the model that we're talking about at the moment, and too much change required of the sector in a very short time. But we'll see how it goes. Next slide, please. So the positives from the perspective of lifelong learning, continuing education, it certainly increases the strategic significance of lifelong learning to universities. It's moving from learning as linear and sequential to flexible, step on, step off, with credits accumulated. So the individual gains accreditation for their learning, and that means it's portable. Even though it's skills focused in some ways, it's still portable. They take that qualification if they want to retrain or upskill and then move to a different employer. It disrupts the idea of universities for young people doing full courses. It breaks down barriers between the technical and vocational and the higher education sector, and it uses a funding mechanism to address national issues of skill shortage, skilled workforce shortage, to provide innovative solutions. The negatives on the next slide, please, Carme, are that it's easy to take a view, and this is what many universities are pushing back against, is this view of learning for work only. It isn't just about skills, and the Singaporean model shows this, that it's got to have opportunities for individuals to understand how to learn and how creativity, etc., all factor into the skills we need for employment, as well as just technical and vocational skills. Institutional rebadging and rebranding of existing programs is something that concerns our professional association enormously, that you have to change programs, obviously, that you could end up having a learner using their credits on a program that is basically just one module out of a degree program without it being significantly modified for a continuing education, lifelong learning perspective. And the other one is that priorities will be set on what is approved and what happens locally and what might be funded locally in key universities by central regional government and not necessarily by learner demand. But that might happen in the early days, but might shift as time and experience emerges. I think that's my last slide. Is that right, Carme? Yes, it is. So in summary, and pulling back, I suppose, on the key points that Lindsay made, whilst at the moment it looks like skills and innovation and workforce, it's potentially rebadging and it's potentially driven by government, not education, it does provide a great example of ways in which innovation can occur and you can kickstart an economy. The unknowns at the moment are likely to be whether people will take it up, so there's no evidence of demand. It's still a loan that you take out. Thankfully, you don't pay it back unless you earn a particular amount of money, but it is a loan. And it may limit what lifelong learning and continuing education are understood to be. But as a professional association, we're working really hard to make sure that innovation, the brilliance that is possible through learning and through higher education is understood by all and is available in their local university and college. Companies are not paying, obviously, for a skilled workforce, but there is a skills levy that the government charges or takes from employers and has been used for apprenticeships, and it is now going to be used in another growth and skills context, but is slightly different to this. So there is, and that's not necessarily joining up, but there's a lot of lobbying to make sure that happens. So hopefully it will start to look like Singapore as it emerges, and it starts next year, and there are so many unknowns. So that's the English model at the moment, likely to become the UK model. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Mary, for this very clear presentation of the English model. I'm gonna now pass the floor to Tamer Atabarut, who is a professor at Bogaci University and the Secretary General of UCAN, who will open the discussion. Thank you, Tamer.
Thank you, Pascal, for giving the floor to me. First of all, I would like to thank you all our speakers for setting such a rich and global perspective in our global seminar. And we have heard valuable insights on data, policy frameworks, and diverse national approach to funding the lifelong learning. And very interestingly, today here at Bogaci University, we are also hosting a two-day workshop on climate finance and the funding of the green transition. And during those sessions, the bankers, investors are here. And I'm actually joining you from that venue. Of course, I may ask them how we can also fund the lifelong learning. But anyway, this coincides, highlights something very important to me. Funding is not just a challenge for lifelong learning, of course, and it's critical and shared issue across many sectors today. So, not taking too much time, I would like to now invite both the audience and our panelists to engage more. And please feel free to challenge ideas, bring examples, or raise practical concerns. As far as I see, there's a question on the chat box by Lindsay, and she has just raised a question: how far do you think addressing funding alone can go in strengthening a national lifelong learning culture in your national contexts? So this is a general question to all our panelists. So I don't know who wants to take the first floor, the word. And by the way, in the meantime, I would like to also encourage other participants, if they want to raise any questions to the panelists, please feel free and text it. So from our panelists, is someone less to share ideas about the question by Lindsay?
Hi, Renee, perhaps I'll start just to agitate the waters a bit. um, Addressing funding alone, I don't think it alone will go as far in strengthening a national lifelong learning culture. Quite honestly, the funding gives them access to that culture if they want to tap into it. But the culture building, the understanding that lifelong learning brings benefits, that it strengthens the individuals, it strengthens society as a whole, and it strengthens the nation, has to be tackled alongside the funding. So over here in Singapore, we were quite careful in putting together the messages sent by the government, via schools, institutions, that learning has clear benefits. And in an Asian society, learning is revered from young. It's imbued in us from childhood, the value of learning through school, through it's important that people keep learning and that we grow as we learn, and we form societal links and strengthen bonds through learning. So it looks kind of soft. It looks like it's a big picture, airy-fairy kind of concept, but when people go through learning and they see benefits, in terms of growth at work, growth in society, I think it sends clear signals that learning has those benefits, and with that comes the lifelong learning culture. So what funding does is to just give you a way in to this, if you'd like to tap in. And so I think on its own, it would be a little bit difficult to strengthen culture just via funding. But yes, please.
Thank you, Irene, for your contribution.
Just to build on that, and in a way, I wish I would have been the last panelist, because I've heard so many common themes, even though it's a transatlantic webinar, and each of us has their own experiences at the national, institutional, even personal level. I think that I've heard some common themes, and just to build on this, we cannot work in silos, right? Even though we have funding, we need those support systems from an institutional standpoint to support the learner. We need the employer to be engaged as well to support the learner financially, but also, giving them the space, the time to do that. And so in my previous role, I was in an administrative role where industry partnerships and institutional partnerships were very important. And so from a higher education standpoint, we'd sit down with local employers to talk about their needs. And so it was a collaboration where we would support learning as higher education institutions, lifelong learning as well through professional and continuing education programs. And, employers would also be willing to invest more in training their employers. And so we do talk, and Amy's here as well in UPCEA and AAACE as well, about collaboration. And so, again, we cannot just have conversations about funding without having those other perspectives and support systems. And going back to motivation, learners need to be motivated to engage in learning, start that learning journey, and complete that learning journey. Because here in the US, we have more than 41 million learners who started a degree and never finished. and higher ed institutions are eager to re-enroll those learners. And going back to Joanne, right, the value of education, but also that pressure for generating revenue, we need to find a balance, and we need to go back and remember that we do provide access to education, and that's the mission of what we do.
If I can fold in on that, I love that you mentioned that, Karina. You're such a bridge builder, and I appreciate your talent on this. So just as many of you mentioned, and particularly Mary, in the US, there's a tension in terms of the outcome of a degree versus its ROI, its value. And so when we see something like Workforce Pell or employer engagement in terms of building credentials, we see this additional layer of value very, very intently added on. So that gets to Lindsay's question about a national lifelong learning culture. We are embedding workplace needs and outcomes within the credentials. But one of the Trojan horses that we're seeing across at least in the States, and I'm not entirely sure if we're seeing it in other entities, but we are seeing the disaggregation of the degree, not just a 90 credit, which I realize that Europe has been doing for ages and well, but we're also seeing this disaggregation of a degree. So the short-term credentials that I mentioned in terms of Workforce Pell, many institutions are now framing an undergraduate degree around stackable chunks that can be entered, completed, and then go back and do upward mobility, come back and get another job and do more of this. So by the time you realize it, you have completed the 5 or 8 stacks that are a degree. This is one of the ways that we're addressing the 41 million that have some college and no credential that Karina wisely mentioned. And so I think together, part of all those pieces in the ecosystem are beginning to recognize this lifelong learning culture. But it isn't just done in a silo or in a vacuum, as I think some of you have mentioned. Thank you.
If I can jump in too, Amy, I really appreciate that's exactly, I think what's happening across the world, but in Canada. One thing I would add is I think there is sometimes a conversation around devaluing the degree or an education. And I guess I would challenge that to say it's not an either or, that we're talking about an and system. So we're expanding it's like when you design courses and, you use universal design. You're not adding on, you're designing you're widening the margins. And so I think we need to make sure that we're allowing space for all of those options, because the reality is people can't always go and do a 4-year degree and have that support. It's for a select few people. Lots of people are working. They're coming at this later in adult. They need to dive in. They need to go out and work. They're raising families. They've got aging parents. So we have to universities and others have to just work as a larger system. And I think there's such value in undergraduate degree at a certain stage. Sometimes I feel employers and others want people to graduate as fully formed, skilled workers. And the reality is, developmentally, we're also at different stages at different times in our life, and adult learners are at a different stage. So they can also, they've got different responsibilities, but they're also different kinds of learners. And the last thing is, I just want to say is that we know that back to that life learning funding really helps people get their access, as others have said, as you said, Renee, but it's also the social determinants of health. We know there's health benefits. There's, it combats social isolation when people learn together in whatever format. So I think there's an important thing around raising that awareness around all of the benefits of lifelong learning, and how important it is for many things. Yes, for getting jobs, but also just for engaging with others, and having a community.
Thanks. Can I just come in there as well? I heard a great quote the other day, and it also spoke to what you were saying, Joanne, except this is around the value, the perceived value. It's also forcing institutions to focus on learners taking courses that make sense to them to achieve the outcomes they want. That's the first time I've ever heard anybody from our Department for Education articulate it from the learner's perspective. And therefore, the way universities package the courses they offer has to come from that value perspective, rather than just, well, you're this age, so the next step is to go to university and be a teacher or a doctor or whatever. I just think we also there was a wonderful presentation at UCEN a couple of years ago, the conference on one of the generations. There were two Slovenian or Slovakian presenters who talked about Gen Z, I think, and their view on higher education, which was one of the studies was on the ambience, the space, you know, and they liked the library as a backdrop, but they thought the books that were in it were, you know, so old-fashioned you wouldn't even bother. So it's that also keeping up with the changing demographic that we have, who have very, very different expectations, I think, than older people like myself had about progression and family expectations of a linear pathway through education. So I think we have to be able to speak to that as well.
Yeah, thank you all for all our panelists for their contribution to this question. And in the meantime, Pascal has raised a question about the motivation of the individuals. And he asked what more can be done to motivate individuals to take up funding opportunities. So if you want to add something in this perspective, please go forward. How we can motivate more the individuals to take part.
I think that it's hard to motivate them to start, since we're talking about a diverse population and diverse programs. And so, for example, here in higher education, the recruitment team is very well resourced to make sure that they are answering prospective learners' questions and so, but that part of how do we convince them to even be curious about it is still tricky. This is where the employers or, you know, state level programs or so are important, so that prospective adult learners may know about those opportunities.
Thank you, Cornina. If not another contribution, then I will give the word to Christina Paulos. She has raised her hand to ask a question, I think, or a comment. Yes, Christina.
Thank you, Tamer. In terms of our transferability to other continents, it would be interesting for me about your experience about Canada and US, but also other continents. Just recently, I've been to Kenya, where I expected a lot of engagement from the authorities, also from the government, that universities have to build up lifelong learning centers anywhere within the communities, because they put different universities within communities instead of cities to get community more involved. And it would be interesting for me how far you have gone to transfer credits from these countries to your countries, and also transversal and even between the continents. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And in the meantime, Richard, make a comment about supply and demand perspective, what we are providing as universities, and what about the demand is coming from the individuals and also from the sectors are sometimes changing and not with spell. So he has just contributed his ideas in this issue. Thank you.
I can offer Christina just an example of something, which is kind of an interesting model. Is so, you know, so you can issue we have a faculty member at the University of Victoria who's working with waste workers in Brazil. So she's actually worked with others in Brazil to create programming around waste pickers. They're very low in the status. They have no access to education. There's no recognition of what they do. And because she worked with them, she's created curriculum. And we credential it through continuing studies. This is non-credit, but we've given it a micro certificates, and we've looked at the curriculum. We're working with the faculty, and they deliver it on site with people there. So the faculty flies down, they deliver it. And this waste picker's micro-credential, because we gave it a credential at the university, it's now recognized by the governments. Governments are interested suddenly. So they're down in Brazil, and others are looking at, well, how do we now create some funding and training and other skills development? And the interesting part of framing it was, I think where it was framed was like, this is really important work in a global context around how we manage waste from a sustainability perspective. So giving it that, so elevating the work that's happening and providing some education around it has created kind of a professionalization in a weird way of what's happening there. And it has changed the lives of those folks who are involved in the program to see what they do as valuable and as meaningful and as recognized. So, I mean, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but the question to me is, and how do we as educators contribute to the mobility, the social mobility of folks in other countries and around in our own countries, and think in innovative ways around how that can happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I think we are almost in the end of the open discussion. And so I would like to wrap up before giving the floor to Pascal. So what we have heard today is that there is no single solution in it, but there is a shared recognition on sustainable lifelong learning, which requires shared responsibility, innovative tools, and strong commitment to inclusion. And the real challenge ahead is not just designing funding models, but maybe implementing them effectively across the context. So this is as my gathering wording. So now I would like to give the word to Pascal once more for closing remarks. Thank you once more again for all the panelists and all the participants for their contribution. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tamer, and thanks all the people who gave presentations and asked questions and so on during this panel. I think this is really was a really excellent seminar. I think from what I remember, I think it's the first time that we tackle this question, I mean, in a really very straight way. Sometimes we talk a bit about funding or money, but not that much from what I remember. So I think that was really great, and I think we should probably look at this theme in also in some future events. This is great. I remind you about the position paper that was published today about the Robin Hood model. Not only about reading it, but if you can also, in a way or another, react to it, because it's a bit provocative, I would say. Already the name, Robin Hood. But this is really something that I think also came from our heart as professional in university lifelong learning, trying to also describe what are our challenges and some of the constraints. So really feel free to react to it, to share about your experience and to what extent you live the same situation. Before we leave today, we would like to remind you of the UCAN conference in Cagliari. I think that Carme has a nice slide to about the conference, Empowering Futures, Lifelong Learning, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in a Changing World. Join us. I mean, the place is obviously fantastic, but the content will also be really, really excellent. So we look forward to seeing you in Cagliari. I don't know, Carme, if you want to add something about the conference.
Sorry, I was trying to find the micro. No, I only wanted to say that today, precisely, the full program is available online. So if you follow this QR link, you'll be able to go into the website of the conference, and one of the options is program, and please feel free to look at it. I think that we have a set of extraordinary keynote speakers, and everything is planned. So I hope to see many of you in Cagliari in June.
Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for attending this global seminar, and have a good night for the people in Asia, day for the people in the US, and evening for the people in Europe. And we look forward to seeing you again in Cagliari on some other occasion. Thank you very much.